So good to have you here this weekend. For those of you who are at our Kitchener campus, welcome. For those of you who are here in our Waterloo campus, for those of you who are all around the world watching online, we are just so fired up and so glad that you're here this morning on this Canada Day weekend. Isn't it great to be a Canadian? Isn't it great to be in part of this country? Just an awesome experience for us, and we're so thankful for this country. And we're so glad that you're hanging out with us this weekend as well, and that you didn't take off like it seems half the congregation did, but we're glad you're here. And really are. So I want to talk about a problem that we have. It's a problem that we have all the way around the world. It's a problem that no matter which country you go to, which context you look in, that people have this problem. And it is a particular problem that happens in the West. And I especially want to think about Canada today. It doesn't matter which province you're in, which territory you're in, you'll find this thing happening. And I'm going to call it a disease as a title this morning, if I can. And it's just everywhere. And in particular, when you think about Canada, I think Waterloo region is a place where this has been infecting and affecting a lot of people in big time ways. It has messed up marriages, it has messed up families, it has messed up friendships, it has messed up all kinds of stuff. It has really entrapped people, and ultimately, not only does it mess up relationships, horizontal relationships, but it has caused people to have very broken relationships with God, very distant relationships with God. In fact, in some cases, people have turned away from God because of this disease. And the disease that I'm talking about, I'm sure you've heard of it, it's called affluenza, okay? And this is how you say the word affluenza. Can you say it with me, please? What's the word? Affluenza. Have you heard of affluenza? If you look it up in the dictionary, here's how this word is defined. A deadly virus related to the mammon and idolatry strain of diseases, you may never have heard of those before, that causes people to be controlled by their abundance of money, property, and other material goods, riches, and wealth. So there is this disease called affluenza that has gripping people and keeps them separated from God in big ways and messes up relationships. It's not just money, it's stuff, it's possession, it's all those kinds of things can sometimes grip our hearts and keep us away. Now, there's some diseases that they've sort of been birthed lately, and some diseases we would look at as being with part of mankind since its beginning. And this is one of those diseases that's kind of always been there. And this morning I want to talk about it, and maybe you have to examine your own heart and see if affluenza has got a grip on you. We're going to talk about how to be inoculated from affluenza and what the infection's like and how it affects our lives this morning. We're going to do that by digging again into this book called Ecclesiastes. Remember, we've been hanging around Ecclesiastes, which is a book that's penned by Solomon. Now, there's some debate about exactly who wrote Ecclesiastes. I'm going to lean into the fact that it was Solomon that wrote this book. And in this particular book, remember, he's kind of an interesting sort of character, right? Because what he decides to do is experiment with life to see if he can find satisfaction, to see if he can find those things that will truly satisfy. So here's a guy with like an outrageous IQ, and he's got all kinds of power and all kinds of wealth. He's got kind of no moral boundaries, and what he decides to do is dig into life and see if he can discover what can truly bring satisfaction. And so he studies it in his head, he experiments with his life, he goes in all kinds of different directions, and we've been looking at those. And this morning, what he's going to do is unpack this thing called affluenza. And if anybody could unpack it, it would be Solomon, right? Now, it'd be really easy as I talk about money and stuff this morning for you to say, well, that's for that person over there, or that's for that person over there. I don't really have that much, and so on. And so just to kind of level the playing field, let me just put this up on the screen. It's not about how much money we have. It's about what? How much money has us, right? Or if I can tweak it a little more, it's not about how much stuff you have. It's about how much stuff has you. In other words, you don't have to have a lot of money and be caught up with affluenza. You could have a lot of money and a lot of stuff and not be affected by affluenza. So it doesn't really matter. So let's just make the playing field level this morning and say that I think for every one of us in the room, the potential to get bit by the affluenza bug is very real for everybody, no matter who we are, right? It's not how much you have, it's how much it has you. And to understand that Solomon really kind of has a big understanding of this, and that he was someone who was definitely bit by the bug. I want to look at some passages in 1 Kings. I want to just read to you some passages from 1 Kings that kind of describe the wealth, the affluence, the stuff, the position that this guy had. So that when he talks to us about affluenza, you'll be able to say, oh, okay, well, he gets it, he gets it, he gets it. And it's pretty incredible about this guy, right? So in 1 Kings chapter 10, look at what verse 4 says. When the queen of Sheba, so this queen comes to visit Solomon, when the queen of Sheba saw all the wisdom of Solomon and the palace he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his officials, the attending servants in their robes, his cupbearers, and the burnt offerings he made at the temple of the Lord, she was overwhelmed, which is kind of a cool word. I love it. You know, overwhelmed is kind of a word I use a lot. She's overwhelmed. She's like going, wow, this is crazy. It's crazy all the stuff you've got. She said to the king, she says to Solomon, the report I heard in my own country about your achievements and your wisdom is true, but I did not believe these things until I came and saw with my own eyes. Indeed, watch this, indeed, not even half was told me. In wisdom and wealth, you far exceeded the report I heard. So have you ever had somebody brag about somebody else and then you kind of meet the person and you go, whew, wasn't anywhere near what they said they were about? Because we'll tend to sort of really speak hyperbolic. We'll tend to exaggerate around people, right? Well, she's heard all these reports about Solomon. She shows up and goes, man, they didn't even tell me about half how great and how awesome and how much stuff you've got, how much money you've got. You go down to verses 23 and 24 in 1 Kings, and here's what it says. King Solomon was greater in riches and wisdom than all the other kings of the earth. Okay, that's the reputation. This dude's like the top earners, the guy's the most wealthy people on the planet. He's numero uno. Okay? The whole world sought audience with Solomon to hear the wisdom that God had put in his heart. Year after year, everyone who came brought a gift, articles of silver and gold, robes, weapons and spices and horses and mules, and so on and so on and so on. Not only is he wealthy, he just gets wealthier and wealthier and wealthier and wealthier. He has a whack of stuff. If anybody has the potential for affluence to affect them, to infect them, it's this guy, right? In fact, some extra biblical writing, that is writing outside of the Bible by Hebrews and by Jews and other historians, one man culled out of that this description of Solomon, which I find rather fascinating. It's a description of him off to his cottage, okay? So some of you are heading off to a cottage or camping or something. Imagine this is how Solomon does it. He writes, dressed in snow-white raiment, riding in his chariot of state, which was made of the finest cedar, decked with gold and silver and purple, and carpeted with the costliest tapestry worked by the daughters of Jerusalem, and attended by a bodyguard of 60 valiant men of the tallest and handsomest of the young men of Israel, arrayed in Tyrian purple with their long black hair freshly sprinkled with gold dust, every day glittering in the sun, okay? He's on his way to the cottage. So you sort of get this idea that if anybody understands what it's like to have possessions and have wealth and have stuff, it's Solomon. Not only does he understand what it's like to have stuff and wealth, he also understands what it's like for stuff and wealth to have him. So what he writes to us in this journal, when we get to chapter 5, we're going to start at verse 8, we're going to go to verse 20. What he does when he gets to this point in his journal is he sort of describes to us affluenza from not only his intellectual perspective and his evaluation of his culture around him, but he's going to talk about how it has affected his own life as well. So you see a personal kind of testimony. And what I want us to do as we're looking at this is ask ourselves the same question. Does affluenza impact my life right now? What is it doing in my world? Because Solomon wants to talk about it. And what he's going to do, first of all, is talk about the effects of affluenza. How does it affect me? What does it do to people? When you get bit by this bug, what happens to you? And watch what he says. First of all, it can corrupt you. Can you read that with me? You ready? It can corrupt you. It can corrupt you. It can mess you up. Now, here's what's really fascinating to me. In verses 8 and 9, he's going to tell us how affluenza corrupts us, messes us up. And he talks about positions of power. He talks about politicians. He talks about people in authority in government. He talks about kings. He picks on his own position, which is really fascinating. And he's going to tell us why there is such a strong infection, okay, of this virus in the realm of people who are in political power. and I think almost pulls himself into the conversation. Watch what he says in verse 8. If you see the poor oppressed in a district and justice and rights denied, don't be surprised at such things. He says, if you're seeing this happening, and you've seen it, you've watched on the news, you've got, you've read it in the paper, maybe somebody sent you a Facebook posting or whatever, and you saw injustice, and you feel for that person, or you feel that, and it's happening in the land. He says, don't be surprised, for one official is eyed by a higher one, and over them are others higher still. The increase from the land is taken by all. The king himself profits from the fields. Now, here's what he's saying to us. For one official is eyed by another. So you've got one official here who is trying to get his take. And if I go down here, watch this. The increase from the land, think of taxes, okay? So the government is bringing taxes in. Here's what he's saying. One official is eyeing his own piece of the pie that he's going to take from out of the taxes, and the other person's watching him so they can take some of the piece of the pie that person's taking of the piece of the pie, and somebody else is over them, and ultimately you get to the king who's doing it as well. So what's happening is that people are ripping people off in places of authority, and they can seem to get away with it, and he's saying it corrupts them. And we've been watching, you're not kind of sick of it sometimes? You watch as some of the politicians in Canada, and thank God we've got some great ones, but we got some other people, and you've heard it in the news, where there's questions around their expenses reports, and so on and so on and so on. And what I think Solomon is saying to us here, that when you get in a position of power, when you get in a position where your accessibility to more wealth or more stuff is at a greater level, the tendency can be for you to have your moral character corrupted. And what's true about politicians, and there's no sense just picking on them, is true of you and me as well. In positions of authority or in any kind of context, it's very easy for us to get for just a little bit more stuff, just a little bit more money, to sacrifice our character. It can corrupt you. So, an honest person, for a little bit of money, corrupts their character by becoming a liar on their income tax form. Or a family that's a peace-filled family suddenly moves into a war zone because they get a little more stuff through an inheritance. Or a person who's got a lot of self-control suddenly becomes a wild risk taker so that they can, and loses big time so they can gamble to get more stuff, more money. Or a father, a good father, a great father, for a little bit more money, gives himself more and more to his work so that he becomes an absentee dad. And you can think about these examples over and over again about how that affluenza can lure us to corrupt our character and our morals. And one of the things I would hope that we would do this morning as we're thinking about what Solomon is teaching us is to really examine our own hearts and go, what about my priorities? What about my goals? What about my values? What about my morals? What am I willing to sacrifice? What is affluenza drawing me to do? And it may be that this morning you come to that point where you go, I gotta stop this. My morals, my values, my goals, my priorities, my relationship with God matters so much so that I'm not going to allow this thing to corrupt me anymore. Because it happens, it's very, very contagious, and it's very, very powerful. So the effects of affluenza, first of all, it can corrupt you. And secondly, he says, it can control you. Can you say that with me, please? It can control you. It can control you. Now, Solomon is going to talk about 5 ways that stuff and money can tend to control us. And what you're going to see in here, in this section of verses in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, are sayings that we have in our culture today that have come from what Solomon is saying here, okay? So it's going to be kind of, you're going to go, whoa, that's the Bible. Whoa, that's the Bible. And we've been saying it in our culture because there was a time when the Bible had significant influence in our culture. But here's the kind of things that affluence can do in our lives. First of all, the more you have, the more you want, okay? The more you have, the more that you want. You ever discover that? The more I have, the more I'm going to want something. Here's what Solomon says. Whoever loves money never has enough. When are you going to have enough money? What's the answer? When I have a little bit more, right? Whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income. This, too, is meaningless. It's meaningless. Never have enough. Just got to have more, right? And it's interesting, he uses the word loves here. He's not saying whoever possesses money never has enough. He's not saying everyone who possesses wealth is never satisfied, because there are some who have not been infected by affluenza. But if you love money, if you value money, if you put it in a place that it shouldn't be, as Paul the Apostle writes in 1 Timothy chapter 6, he says, the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil. He says you need to be really, really careful of it. And one of the things that God would long for us, one of the things Solomon is saying to us, the more you have, the more you tend to want. Have you discovered that? So I'm growing up, and I just said, if I just had a bike, if I have a bike, God, I will be happy for the rest of my life. I just want a bike. So my dad found this used bike. He brought it home. He had to put blocks on the pedals because it was way too big for me. I got my bike. I learned to ride. I skinned my knees. I bruised my face. I did everything. People on the street cheered me on. But I finally got my bike, and I finally learned how to ride it. But you know what I discovered? I wanted something else. I wanted a stereo. God, the bike was okay, it wasn't bad, but a stereo, that would be good. If you got me a stereo, I never want anything else for the rest of my life. And I got a stereo, and it was pretty good, and it was pretty loud. It shook the windows in the house, but I wanted something more. I said, God, if you can give me a girlfriend, if just a nice girl, a wonderful girl, if I have a girlfriend, then I think I'll be satisfied. And so I found a girlfriend. She was a nice girl, but I really wanted more than that, right? You know what I'm saying? So I ended up with wanting a car, and I wanted a house. Have you ever discovered how that the more you have, the more you want? You ever notice that's what happens? Affluenza, it's coming at us, okay? Here's another thing he says. The more you have, the more you consume. Solomon is talking about our carbon footprint. Way back 3,000 years ago, he's saying there's something that happens to us. The more we have, the more we tend to use, okay? The more we tend to consume. So watch how he puts it. As goods increase, so do those who consume them, which is kind of interesting. He's kind of showing us getting bigger and bigger and bigger and consuming more and more and more, if you can see the imagery here. And what benefit are they to the owners? Except to feast their eyes on them. They just get more and more stuff, more and more stuff, more and more stuff. Our very first house that Carol and I ever owned was just outside of Dorchester, Ontario. It was 400 square feet, okay? That was from the outside. I measured it, 20 feet by 20 feet. She and I lived in there. We had 3 kids and a dog named Mr. Smith and a cat named Dog. And we lived inside this house. He had some psychological problems. So anyway, we lived inside this house, and we had all of our stuff there. And the day came when I moved to Kitchener-Waterloo, and we bought a semi-detached house. And it was huge compared to this 400 square footer. We couldn't get into the house right away, so we were staying with some people in Kitchener-Waterloo before the closing date in our home. You've been there. All of our stuff was in storage. So on moving day, got a bunch of friends, and on moving day, which was a Saturday, drove down, rented the U-Haul, drove to the place. The guys were there. We loaded our stuff on the truck. We drove back to our new semi-detached home. They unloaded the truck. I drove back to the rental place. I got it there by 10:30 in the morning, okay? Filled up with gas again. And when I remember the guys, when we then loaded the truck, they said to us, like, is this all you have? And we went, yeah, what can you put in 400 square feet? Not very much, right? So that's what we had. Well, you know what happened? You know what we did in that house? We filled it up with stuff. You ever done that? And then we decided this is too small. We added 2 more kids, got rid of the cat and dog, but it was still too small, right? So what we decided is we got to do something about this. So we moved to a bigger house, which we then filled up. You ever done that? Okay, filled it up, filled it up, filled it up. That's what we're like. We tend to be people who, what do? The more you have, the more you want to consume, the more you want to gather even more. So look at this. He also says the more you have, the more you, what's the word? Worry. You worry. Here's the problem with affluenza. It can turn you into a worry wart, whatever that means. I don't know. But look what he says here to us in verse 12. The sleep of a laborer is sweet, whether they eat little or much. But as for the rich, their abundance permits them no sleep. Now, this is a proverb. Now, you have to understand something about proverbs. Proverbs are not absolute statements. They are general statements of truth, okay? So generally speaking, he is saying that a person who doesn't have much, works from day to day, actually sleeps like a baby, which is also a proverb. It isn't always true that babies sleep well. Anybody been a parent here understand what that means, right? And he's not saying that every laborer who doesn't have anything sleeps really well, and everybody who's got a lot of money has a sleep disorder. That's not what he's saying. But he's saying, generally speaking, if you have got money, if you've got possessions, if you've got affluence, and that's the thing that you're pursuing, generally speaking, you're going to struggle with sleep. you are a person who struggles with worry. That's what he's saying here. Number 4, here's what he says. The more you have, the more you hurt. Well, if the more you have, the more you want, if the more you have, the more you consume, if the more you have, the more you worry, then it's going to hurt you, right? And so here's what he says to us in verse 13. I have seen a grievous evil. It's an interesting kind of word. A grievous evil, the idea here is I've seen misery in people's lives. It's like evil. It's grievous. I've seen a grievous evil under the sun, wealth hoarded to the harm of its owners. In other words, people have all this affluence, and it's messing them up. It's hurting them. How does it hurt them? Jealousy. We already talked about the list of the other things. They worry, they're consuming it, and so on. There's jealousy. I got to be like the Joneses, and there are comparisons going on. There's anger with people. There's breakups that take place. There's all kinds of things that can happen as you become more and more consumed by this. You step outside your moral boundaries. You want more and more affluence, and off you go. And he's saying it will ultimately hurt you. And then he says this. The more you have, the more you, what's the word? You lose, right? The more you lose. Wealth lost through some misfortune, so that when they have children, there's nothing left for them to inherit. And we all know stories, I'm sure you know stories of rags to riches, the Cinderella story where somebody starts out very poor and they become very wealthy. But we also know stories of riches to rags, right? And we've got situations where we've got athletes who make a ridiculous amount of money, who when they're done, they've been making millions and millions and millions of dollars. They have nothing left at the end, and the list of those is significant. Or people who have won a lot of money in a lottery, who then discover when they've lost all their money that they've lost not only their money, but their family and their friends, or so-called friends as well, and they're alone and isolated, and you hear these stories. And it's like Solomon is saying, if you're making affluence the source of your life meaning and your life purpose and your life goals and your security, when you lose it, you lose big time. You lose big time. There's a man who, by the name of Robert Horton, who writes, people who set their minds and hearts on money, and we could write this, people who set their minds and hearts on stuff are equally disappointed whether they get it or whether they don't. So affluence can affect us in all of these different ways. So he's been telling us that it can corrupt you, it can control you, and then I got into this kind of rut where I had to come up with another K word. So I came up with this one. It can con you. What do you think? Too late. Can con you. It can deceive you. It can trick you. It can manipulate you. It can put you into a bad spot. It can you say it with me? Come on, we can do it. It can con you. It can con you, okay? Now watch what Solomon says here. I just love the way he writes. Watch this. Everyone comes naked from their mother's womb. We're all in agreement with that. And as everyone comes, so they depart. You've heard that before, right? Naked you come, naked you go. A hearse cannot pull a U-Haul trailer. You don't ever see that happening, right? I mean, you can't take it with you. That's really what it says. Everyone comes naked from their mother's womb, and as everyone comes, so they depart. They take nothing from their toil that they can carry in their hands. Now, we see what he's saying to you now. He's saying, okay, now think about this. You can't take it with you. So what are you going to do with it? This too is a grievous evil. As everyone comes, so they depart. And what do they gain? Since they toil for the wind, he's basically saying if you're just chasing it and you're not going to get it, you can't take it with you, you're kind of chasing after the wind. All their days they eat in darkness with great frustration, affliction, and anger. He is saying generally, if you're someone who your affluence is what your life is all about, as I mentioned before, it's your security in life. I got this stuff, it's going to make me secure. It's my significance. So look at what I've got. Look at how great I am. It gives my life meaning and purpose. And ultimately, it ultimately disappears. You can't take it with you. Are you really using the right kind of measurement? Isn't that kind of silly? Isn't all the frustration and the anger and the affliction that you're going through to gain and gain and gain and gain, isn't that really something that ultimately is stupid to be doing that? There's a missionary who went to Ecuador. So many of us who have heard of him, his name is Jim Elliot, and Jim Elliot went to a tribe in Ecuador. He wanted to share the gospel with them. And the very tribe he was trying to reach ultimately killed him and some of his fellow missionaries. And it was like worldwide news back in the 50s. And Elliot was a man who had a deep, close personal walk with God. And even though he died, I believe, in his late 30s, early 40s, he had a journal. And in looking through his journal, he had made a statement that I think has resonated in my heart for decades, and it goes like this. He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. If we could flip it around, Solomon might write it, he is a fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. So Jim Elliot is basically saying, I want to put God where he needs to be in my life. I want to embrace God and put my values around him and pursue him. I can't lose that. That needs to be my priority. And yet we look in the world and we can see story after story of men and women who have made affluence their ultimate goal, their ultimate pursuit in life, the measurement of success, and so on. And the stories are rampant about how that has failed them, how it's let them down. So for example, there's this interesting story about Yusuf Ismail. He's called the Terrible Turk. He's weighed 305 pounds. You can see he died quite a while ago. He was a professional wrestler in Europe. And he came to the U.S. to fight another wrestler, an American champion by the name of Strangler Lewis. Well, they have great names, wrestlers, great names. So Strangler Lewis was called Strangler Lewis because he had this move that he would make when he was fighting in a wrestling match. He would take his arm, and he'd wrap it around his opponent, pump up his bicep until he cut off the oxygen, and they would pass out. Then he'd jump up, and the crowd would cheer, and he'd get his reward. So he was about 200 pounds. This dude was over 300. So there's a 100-pound difference, which, of course, just amps up the entertainment value. So everybody shows up to watch this wrestling match. Strangler Lewis makes his move. He's around behind the Turk, and he starts to wrap his arm around his neck and discovers this guy really doesn't have much of a neck. It's kind of like his head goes right into his shoulders, and he can't really get his hold on him like he wants to. The Turk flips him around, pins him to the mat, wins the prize, wins the bout. The hero is from Europe. So when he's given his prize money, which is $5,000, the Terrible Turk says, I want it in gold. I don't like this American money. I want it in gold. So they gave him $5,000 in gold, and gold weighs a lot. He takes the gold, he puts it in his belt around his waist, and that's where he wears it. Gets on the SS Burgoyne, which is a ship that's leaving back to Europe, and off the coast of Nova Scotia, they hit a storm, and the ship starts to go down, and our friend, the Terrible Turk, decides to jump overboard and swim. But he goes to the bottom of the ocean like a rock, okay, and dies. Here's a guy whose affluence literally kills him. And you wonder about how much weight our affluence has on our own hearts, how much it's tugging us and pulling us down and moving us away from where we need to be. Let me read you another story. You might have heard of this guy, Steve Jobs. I had a couple of you send me, in light of our series, just this excerpt, apparently, from a journal that Steve Jobs had written. You remember him, of course, iPod, iPads, iPhones, Mac computers, and so on. A brilliant, brilliant man, extremely wealthy in so many ways. So, but he, as you can see, died in October of 2011. And on his deathbed, here's what he's writing. I reached the pinnacle of success in the business world in others' eyes. My life is an epitome of success. However, aside from work, I have little joy. In the end, wealth is only a fact of life that I'm accustomed to. At this moment, lying on my sick bed and recalling my whole life, I realize that all the recognition and wealth that I took so much pride in have paled and become meaningless in the face of impending death. And a little while later, he writes this. Non-stop pursuing of wealth will only turn a person into a twisted being just like me. God gave us the senses to let us feel the love in everyone's heart, not the illusions brought about by wealth. The wealth I have won in my life, I cannot bring with me. And I doubt anybody in the room is going to be affluent as either Ivan, the Terrible Turk, or as Steve Jobs. And remember, it's not about how much you have, it's about how much it has you. And the question of the morning is, what do you do about that? What is the way of staying away from this infection called affluenza? So I want to just wrap things up by talking about how do you cure affluenza. And to do that, we're going to look at verses 18, 19, and 20 in Ecclesiastes chapter 5. In 3 simple verses, Solomon is going to make a shift that I want to talk to you about and help us understand how we can do this. So here's what we read in verse 18. This is what I have observed to be good, that it is appropriate for a person to eat, to drink, and to find satisfaction, that's the theme of our series, to be satisfied, in their toilsome labor under the sun during the few days of life God has given them, for this is their lot. Moreover, when God gives someone wealth and possessions and the ability to enjoy them, to accept their lot and be happy in their toil, this is a gift from God. They seldom reflect on the days of their life because God keeps them occupied with gladness of heart. So he says something to us in verse 20. It's a beautiful verse. He says to us, if you get a good handle on this thing, you can actually be so filled with joy that the stuff doesn't matter. Now, do you remember the way that Solomon unpacks the book of Ecclesiastes? We've talked about this a number of times. You remember that he says that often what he does in his book is he will present his case by looking at life under the sun, under heaven, or upon the earth, only in a horizontal way, right? And then what he will do after he's teased us and taunted us with how bad it is, he'll do a vertical flip and he'll bring God into the equation. When he brings God into the equation, he's trying to tell us that that's what we need to do as well in our lives. So watch what he does. Let's go back and look at the verses again. And here's what he's really telling us. I want you to put God first. Now watch what he does. This is what I have observed to be good, that it is appropriate for a person to eat, to drink, and to find satisfaction in their toilsome labor under the sun during the few days of life. God shows up, okay? The few days of life that God has given them, for this is their lot. He writes, moreover, when God gives someone wealth and possessions and the ability to enjoy them, to accept their lot and be happy in their toil, this is a gift of God. Verse 20, they seldom reflect on the days of their life because God keeps them occupied with gladness of heart. So after talking to us on this horizontal level and not mentioning God at all, he now brings God 4 times into these last 3 verses. And he says, if you really want to fight affluenza, you have to make sure that the affluence doesn't become our God. It doesn't sit on the throne of our lives. You need to make sure that you push it aside and allow God to be the number one, that he is the one that you go to for satisfaction, for significance in life, for security, for purpose, for meaning. It's all about God. If you don't do that, I need to tell you, he says, affluence wants to come and nudge God out. Not only does he tell us to put God first, okay, which is one of the things that's important for us to remember. The second thing I want you to notice is this. Pursue satisfaction in life outside of affluence. So make sure that you do that. Make sure that you look for satisfaction outside of the stuff and the wealth that you've got. In relationships, in your relationship with God and so on, look for your satisfaction there. Yes, you've got maybe stuff. Don't allow it to become that priority in your world. So, if there's something I would want to leave with you today, it is the truth I want to look at right now. If you forget everything else, that's an okay thing with me. I want you to remember this last thing this morning. When we go back to these 3 verses, verses 18, 19, and 20 in Ecclesiastes 5, not only is he summarizing and getting us to look in a different direction, not only is he bringing God into the equation, but here's the beautiful thing. He's going to tell us that the key that we need to remember is to be thankful for all the affluence we actually have. Watch what he does here. Let's go back to verse 18. This is what I have observed to be good, that it is appropriate for a person to eat, to drink, and to find satisfaction in their toilsome labor under the sun during the few days of life God has what? Has given them. So here's what he's saying. I want you to understand that whatever you have, whatever position, whatever money, whatever stuff, whatever you have in your little collection, that ultimately came from God. It was a gift. And the Bible's really big on teaching this. It teaches us that our ability to work is really a gift from God. The stuff that we gather is a gift from God. Our friends and relationships are a gift from God. Everything is a gift from God. And Solomon is now driving this truth home. When you think about all your stuff, I want you to remember that God has given them. So you understand that what you have has been a gift from God. For this is their lot. And look what he says. Moreover, when God, what's the word? Okay, we've got to try that one again. When God what? When God gives someone, you see what he's doing? When God gives someone wealth and possessions, where'd you get it from? You got it from God. Ultimately, you got it from God. When God gives someone wealth and possessions and the ability to enjoy them, to accept their lot and be happy in their toil, this is what? A gift of God. He is saying you need to look at your life as a gift from God. And then he wraps it up like this: they seldom reflect on the days of their life because God keeps them occupied with gladness of heart. Here's what he's saying. When it comes to anything that you have, your wealth, the stuff, your position, your health, your friends, your church, whatever it may be, if you're the kind of person who will grab hold of this truth, Solomon is saying, if you will see that it's a gift from God, it will change everything, and it will inoculate you from affluenza. So just about every meal, maybe 90% of the meals before we sit down and eat, I pray. I thank God for them. Now, sometimes I'll be honest with you, I don't even remember doing it. Sometimes it's just a habit I don't pay attention to, which is a bad thing. And I can remember being with our kids, and I'll say to them, "Did we say grace?" And they'll say, "Yeah, Dad, you said it." "Oh, okay." So, back to that conversation. You ever had that kind of thing happen? And sometimes I'll pray with my head bowed. Sometimes I'll pray with my eyes open. Sometimes I'll pray out loud. Sometimes I'll pray quietly. Sometimes I'll pray and I'll add a bunch of other stuff in. Sometimes it's pretty rote. But that habit, I think, is a great habit, because what it's doing is it's teaching me, it's reminding me that I need to be thankful. Because maybe you're not like this, but I'm like this. I can allow accomplishments and money and stuff in my world to kind of nudge God out. And what Solomon is telling us is you need to be thankful to God. And if you can practice thankfulness, if you can exercise thankfulness, if you can deliberately be thankful, you will discover that it will push affluenza out of your world. It's interesting because in Psalm 100, the psalmist invites us to enter God's courts. And I love the way Eugene Peterson paraphrases Psalm 100. He says, in order to enter into the courts of God, there's a password, and the password is thank you. Okay? It's thank you. And you think about that and you think, wow, if I could just be a man, a woman, a teen, whatever, and I could be someone who says, thank you to God. Thank you for today. Thank you for my health. Thank you for my country. Thank you for the food. Thank you, thank you, thank you. If I can be a person who has this perpetual attitude of thankfulness, it is going to help me with the affluence infection in my life. In fact, I would argue that for parents, one of the primary things we can teach our kids is to be thankful. I would argue that one of the primary things followers of Jesus should be, more than anybody else on the planet, when we put our faith in him as our sin forgiver and life leader, we should be the most thankful people that are walking the planet. And it should show over and over and over again. What makes you so thankful? What makes you so thankful? I've got this amazing God who loves me. And wow, I was talking in the first service and I was saying to them, when we get to heaven, I think here's what we're going to be, besides not being able to say anything for a while, we're going to be going, I didn't earn this, I didn't deserve, we're going to be saying, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. That's going to be our attitude, like, thank you, like, whoa, how are you today? I'm thankful, man. How are you? I'm thankful too, like, whoa, look at this. And it's going to be so different. And all the opulence and wonder and joy and perfection about heaven is not going to be able to nudge things out of our hearts, because we're going to know then for sure, clearly, this is God's gift to us. So let's get practicing for heaven. Can we do that? Let's practice it right now. Will you bow your heads with me? Heavenly Father, I thank you for all the gifts you've given us. We are an incredibly blessed people. And when we think about history, when we think about our global village, and we realize what part of the village we live in, wow, have we ever been blessed? And sometimes we take it so for granted. Sometimes we take the very thing we've been blessed with and turn it into an idol. And I pray, Heavenly Father, that you would help us to become people who are so incredibly thankful to you, that God, you would be honored and you would be glorified in our lives. We realize this is something we should do. This is something we can do. This is something that would be natural to us if we understood all the dimensions of our world. So make us a people of thankfulness for your glory, our good. In Jesus' name, amen.